Yeah, we're going to look at William Blake. And we're going to move from the Neoclassical period of Alexander Pope and the Enlightenment to the Romantic period. Now, the Enlightenment is often called the Age of Reason. It's one of the ways in which you will hear it described. So called the Age of Reason by those themselves who were the writers of the day. So they're proclaiming reason, and when they do so in a way that sounds like there had been no reason before them. Now, this is marketing, we would call it these days. They're marketing themselves as the rational, as opposed to those that came before them, who are, as you would expect then, not rational or even irrational. In particular, they will be attacking the establishment as it exists, and that is the state and the church. And I talked about this already in terms of the French Revolution, where the man in the center is the king, and on his right are the aristocracy and the clergy, the bishops and so forth. Same in the UK, by the way. There's a House of Lords that has the bishops as well as the aristocracy in that branch. Today's Senate in Canada, the same sort of thing, although we don't have ecclesiastical representation because we don't have a state church in Canada, unlike in England. And on the left are the common people. And we talk about left wing and right wing, and it all points back to that same period of time. We still hold on to those designations, even though the associations are very different. To be a part of the Christian establishment is not to be right wing. In fact, one of the reasons that Christians don't want to be called right wing is because it becomes attributed to the Nazi Party, and that what does that have to do with Christianity? So I want to move away from all that. And so you can use these tags or associations negatively and so forth. But back to the Enlightenment and this period, they call themselves the Age of Reason, and they portray Christianity as an age of irrationalism, superstition, appeals to authority that nonetheless are not based on any reality but made up superstition. And we saw that characteristic of the age of science is the refusal to accept things on the basis of authority or tradition, but rather through the means of scientific objective verification via the scientific method. So you would be able to observe for yourself using the scientific method, which you all studied in high school, right? You remember whatever you did, chemistry, biology, physics, you use a scientific method, and there was a certain methodology that you use. And the way in which we determine that something is objective and true or factual is by following the methodology. And if the methodology followed rigorously and all the extrinsic external variables are kept out of the experiments, if you come up with a conclusion that's the same here as it is in the next room and on the other side of the world and in different times and places, well, that's factual then. That's objective, and it's, that's a good conclusion. That methodology is used to establish what they call truth, although facts are not truth. I need to say, first of all, because we confuse the two all the time. Something that's factual is something that you have made evident to your own eyes. That's what a fact is. It comes from the Latin verb facere, which is to know, to do rather. So I make something for myself, and I can see it, and therefore it is. And now that's going to be connected to something that's true, but it is not by being factual true. It's just that it works. That's what has been demonstrated. But that methodology delivers extraordinary results early on in what we call the natural sciences now. And that same methodology then is given as a way of improving on the way in which cultures traditionally approach the world. Rather than appeal to the authority of somebody outside ourselves, the hierarchies, the government, like the king, the aristocrats, the church, we can prove it for ourselves with our own two eyes. We can verify it as legitimate. And the Age of Reason in general claims that Christianity is a hypothetical, fictional account, which we can't verify, which is true, by the way. You can't verify the accounts of Scripture in an empirical fashion because they're historical events and you can't repeat any historical events. It's not that the biblical accounts that can't be repeated. No historical event can be verified in this fashion because the people are dead. The accounts that you read of, you have to accept on the authority of the word of the people that wrote at the time. And there are other ways of verifying those things, but anyway, they can't follow the methodology of the modern sciences. But that becomes the way in which all human verification incrementally over the course of time becomes more and more predicated on that empirical verification. And you'll even hear people say, if I could meet Jesus, then I might believe in him. Then if I could see with my own two eyes, then I might believe at that point, because then I could see for myself, and it wouldn't be through another third party's account. I would be able to verify it with my own eyes. Didn't work in Jesus' day, by the way. That eyewitness testimony was sufficient to persuade people. It persuaded some, but it didn't persuade all. And in fact, it didn't persuade that many at the time. In fact, his own family didn't believe in him initially, as we hear. And they were eyewitnesses for a lot. But we assume that you have to be an eyewitness, and the Enlightenment pushes very hard in this direction, on the direction of empirically verifying in order to determine whether things are truth. So that becomes empiricism starts to, as it grows in its success over the course of time, becomes the demand for people to say, I'm not going to say it's true unless I can see it. And at that point, any historical doctrine becomes impossible to prove, if that's the criteria and the standard. And if I were an apologist spending the whole class on this, I could demonstrate that nobody ever follows this methodology rigorously in anything in life. You have to trust other people's word on almost everything. Almost everything, you have to have, there's a trust factor, and you have to, is this person credible? Is it sufficiently credible for me to proceed? Yes, etc., etc. Nobody proceeds following the methodology of the empirical sciences. But that's what's demanded here, and the Enlightenment calls the Christian doctrine fiction, and it breaks away with it. And it establishes a new methodology for understanding the world around us, which over the course of time gets called the human sciences. In the 19th century, this is what it's going to be called. It'll be called the, I don't want to throw this at you. It'll be called the Geisteswissenschaften. There you go. It's your new word for the day. I know I'm not going to write it down right now because I'll have to break from this and probably pull my camera down in the process. But the spiritual sciences, it's a way of looking at life from the perspective of man, not from the perspective of God. From the 19th century onward, theology is thrown out of the university. It's not a subject of study in the university, although it's foundational to a university. Theology is at the center of the university, which I believe I've already told you is a medieval Christian institution. It is not there in the ancient world. It comes to being in around year 1000, 1200, depending where you want to set the starting point there. And it's predicated on the idea that in Christ all things hold together. All knowledge is to be found in God. God is the source of all things. He is the end of all things. By understanding him, we can all the diversity of things can be understood through Christ. That's the belief of the university. If you remove God from the university and put man in the center, which happens in the Enlightenment, to the point where in the Age of Reason they actually have a statute of reason in Paris, exalting reason and exalting man. Glory to man in the highest is the phrase of a man named Algernon Swinburne, echoing the Anglican creed on this. You have to start thinking of knowledge in a different way. You have to think it from man's perspective, not from God's perspective. Well, what does that mean? Well, in the Enlightenment, for it to get universal validity, just like the university had, it has to get rid of the specific particularity of human experience. It has to be universally true. And so the Enlightenment will appeal to universal pure reason. And this word pure reason is very important. It means to be purified of all prejudice. In fact, it's fair to say that the Enlightenment is characterized by a prejudice against prejudice. It believes that all prejudices are evil and to be eradicated. Now, I've yet to meet somebody who wants to be called prejudiced or be associated with prejudice. In fact, it's a very strong charge to accuse somebody. It comes in you're a racist, a sexist, or whatever. You're an ist of some sort, right? And that's you're being accused of prejudice. And the Enlightenment is there to eradicate prejudice. And in fact, the point it takes on human nature is also a universal one. So what does that look like for a man-centered understanding of knowledge, and yet the man at the center has no characteristics? What is a human being without any prejudice, any characteristics, any contours? In general, the perspective that is taken, and I'm going to move off here, and you can look at this sometime on your own, was described by a philosopher, a contemporary philosopher. His name is Thomas Nagel. It's called The View from Nowhere. Look it up. And Nagel's hypothesis, or observation more than anything, is that what the Enlightenment does is it tries to look at humanity from the perspective of the gods, as if it were above humanity, as if it were not bound by the limitations of being a human being. And if you want to see a representation of that, I gave you one last time when we looked at the Palace of Versailles. It's built up on a hill, and when you are inside the building and you look out, all you see is sky. You don't see the ground, you're up in the clouds. It's the perspective of heaven. Or if you've traveled in the air, which you have, most of you, when you go above the clouds and you look out and you see there's nothing there. It's above all limitation. That's the attempt to come at humanity from above as if you're not a human being. That's how you become universal in your perspective. You're not limited by your time, your culture, your language, your sex, any of those things. That's the aim of the Enlightenment view of mankind. And that is called pure reason. Now, the effect of this is to attack human nature, not particularly, but universally, because every human being has particular features. And it leans towards conceiving human nature in a disembodied fashion, in a spiritual fashion. So what is common between everybody in the room here is that we all have minds. We also have bodies and so forth, but the bodies divide us. We all look different, but our minds are all the same, hypothetically at any rate. We all have a capacity for thinking. A disembodied sense of self. In fact, the word self starts to rise in prominence in this period. We talk about the self. What is the self? When you talk about being self-conscious, what does that word mean? You ever thought about it? We know what self-consciousness means. Do we? What do you mean by being self-conscious? It means being aware of yourself in contradistinction to everybody else. So it's in a comparative thing. But actually, when you're talking about self-consciousness and you're thinking about that thing in you that's doing the thinking thing, the thinking substance, for lack of a better word. That's what you mean by being self-conscious. You're reflexively thinking about yourself. And so the dominant form of science that arises from the Enlightenment is psychology. Unknown in the ancient world, by the way. There's no discipline called psychology. In fact, to this day, nobody can explain to me what psychology actually studies, even though it's called a science. And I don't mean this to diss the psychologists, although I'm happy to do that, but that's not my purpose here. That's just fun. I just enjoy that, but that's not my purpose. It's more to point that the discipline of psychology, what does it actually study? And ology is a science. What does the discipline of psychology study? And you'll find that you will not get an answer from the psychologist that actually agrees on the subject. Modern psychology is mostly study of the brain, right? The chemical attributes of the brain, how the brain secretes certain chemicals, and there's a lot of studies into that. Is the thing that thinks a material object, like the brain, your cerebellum, the gray matter in your head, is that what thinks? Or is it your mind, which is a very different sort of thing? It's a thing that doesn't have a physical essence and yet allows you to think as if you were outside yourself. Because this is an impossibility to think outside of yourself, isn't it? Isn't it? That's what the Enlightenment does. It makes you think as if you're outside yourself, as if you could be outside yourself, as if universally true things could apply to everybody in every place and every situation. That's something that human beings can do. It's called abstraction. We have the capacity for abstract thought, which is why we can do mathematics, by the way. Mathematics is possible for human beings because we can conceive of things, the principles of things, even though we've never experienced them. There's no such thing as a number. A physical object that it's a number. It's a way of thinking to enumerate it. You can think of one, you can think of many, but you can't think of the discrete numbers 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and on infinitum. And yet we do think of them, and we can think that way. Well, animals can't think mathematically. It's an abstract capacity. It requires a mind. It requires a reason. The Enlightenment calls reason pure reasoning, and what it means by that is disembodied reasoning, non-human reasoning, and then it applies them as the methodology to improve humanity. It's a methodology, and it requires a view from nowhere, just like that in Louis XIV's Versailles. And Louis XIV imposed his view of rationality, which is not just his view, it's the view of the French court. The intelligentsia is in agreement with this on his world and decide we're going to order it rationally, just like the Garden of Versailles, which I showed to you last time. And if you look down, it's very beautiful. There we go. Art of perspective. There you go. Significant. You respect my privacy. Isn't that great? If you look down, it's beautiful. But as I say, if you look from the palace itself and look out, you're above all that. You're not even looking down on it. But this is geometrically beautiful. It's stunning. It's the imposition of a certain mindset on the landscape, and it creates a certain outcome in accordance with mathematical ideas of geometry. Right? You can see this. Suggests the infinity going out into space. Has everyone been in an infinity pool? You know what I'm talking about. Is it, no? An infinity pool? No. I've never been in one, but that's not the sort of place I have the wealth to be able to hang out in. But infinity pool? It's exactly the... I should have started with this, actually. What a thought. There you go. This poor guy is going to get put up on my internet. Serves him right. There you go. Goes over the edge. Now he's unfortunately looking at this, but really it goes out and you look out into nothing. He's in a high building there and the water pours over the edge and then gets brought back in, but that's the infinity pool. You're looking out. It is a certain sense of being in a place where you're not in your body. You're looking out into space as if that was the way you could look at the world. There's a certain appeal to it. I'll take this poor guy off now. But that's the Palace of Versailles. That's the perspective taken. And that's called reason. And Louis XIV's attempt to impose this idea of rationality on the world around him led the French public to protest that there was no consideration for his fellow human beings in his attempt to bring about a reasonable, better world. And there was a strong backlash against the Enlightenment in a period that we're going to talk about today with William Blake, namely the Romantic period. And that backlash was called the French Revolution. And the French revolutionaries on the left wing, the common people, said that you are not actually considering our humanity at all. We're starving. You're creating a rational, superior, better society, and yet we have no bread. And Marie Antoinette says, let them eat cake. It's a famous saying. They don't have, the citizens are complaining they have no bread. Well, let them eat cake. The queen in the palace, who has never had any want not met, thinks that the problem is that they've just run out of bread and eat cake. It tastes better. They have no food at all, but they're totally detached from that. This is the problem with the view from nowhere, is that it can only be taken at such an exalted level that the problems of imposing it down the chain of hierarchy and authority through families and churches and individuals is just overlooked, because the end game is a better world. It's a utopian scheme. Oh, by the way, utopia. What does the word utopia mean? You ever heard of a utopia? Everyone's heard of utopia. What does it mean? Yes?
Ultimate perfect world.
Good. Okay. Anyone else? We can do better than that, but it's very good. It's actually, in Greek, it's you, O-U. And it's for topos. Get rid of Mr. Nagel here. It literally means no place. Fits pretty well with the view from nowhere that it's utopian. Its claim is that it's going to be ideal. It's the perfect. And that's what they think. They drink their own Kool-Aid, right? That it's a place that's going to be much better than the place we're in right now. You'll see. But it's and the u in the Greek is just a particle of negation. It means no, and topos is a place. So it's a no place, a utopia. But utopia from the time of Thomas More is an idealized view of the past even, sometimes. Sometimes it's thinking backwards. There's this time in the past when things were much better, and now they've got much worse. And they sort of sentimentalize the past, and they cast it through rose-colored glasses and so forth. It's a utopia. But usually it's seen as a future goal, right? And science fiction tends to present utopian schemes where, because of following science, the world will become ever more and more enlightened and more superior, and it fits in with the idea of the age of reason, which always goes with progress. But note that progress is never defined in terms of the goal going forward. It's just defined in where it's coming from, but not where it's going towards. And that's because it comes from the age of reason, and it's viewed from nowhere, because it's actually leading you nowhere. It can't tell you where it's leading you. It can tell you where it's leading you from, and it will do so by disparaging the past and to some degree the present, to emancipate you from that, to lead you to the place that's going to be better. But the better has no definition, because if it did have a definition, then you could criticize that definition as well. But so it's an emancipatory project. And the criticism of it that arises in the French Revolution, and this is where we're coming with Mr. Blake, is that this pursuit of reason is dehumanizing. We already saw it with Jonathan Swift last class, that the use of reason, statistics, measurement regarding people in as commodities or as numbers meant regarding people as things that could be bought, sold, and eaten. Somebody afterwards spoke to me and said, well, we could talk about that in the 18th century with the African slave trade as well, and we could. Exactly so. That same mentality, I think, is in this period. The 18th century is a very dark period for the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment ought to have different branding these days. But in the Romantic period, there's a revolt against this, and the revolt is against this sort of reasoning. It's called a revolt against reason, and the Romantics replaced the pursuit of reason with what they call the imagination, or feeling. We'll see this with Mr. Wordsworth next class in particular, but I've had you have your hand up for a while, please. Apologies. Dystopia is a realistic appraisal of what utopian schemes lead to, which is to places that are far worse than we ever imagined they would be. Dystopia is the downstream consequence of utopian schemes having proved to be fallacious and destructive. And so in science fiction, you start getting more and more dystopian schemes presenting as a consequence of people pursuing utopian schemes. Because that's the reality of it, is that when we get rid of the fences, the hedges, the traditional authority structures, we take those all down to make things better, we then suddenly realize that there was a reason why the fence was there and the hedgerow was there and the structure was there and the authority was there, and all we've done is take down the gates and let the enemies swarm through them. And maybe that wasn't such a great idea after all. And the people, when they execute the king, somebody has to be ruling, and that's what happens in the French Revolution, is the ones that chop off the king's head become the leaders. And then comes, so 1789 is the French Revolution. That's the date. And in 1795, the reign of terror begins, in which the leaders of the revolution start chopping off each other's heads. Because the new people are just as tyrannical as their predecessors, because they still, from a Christian perspective, they have the same problem. They're human beings. And yet they recognize no authority, and they have no authority other than doing the will of the people, but the people have no idea what they want. They know what they don't want, but they don't know what they actually want. And the result of this eventually is that the chaos that is unleashed by attacking authority blindly is that they have to bring in somebody in authority who's a strong man. And the strong man's name is Napoleon. Right? You have to bring in a tyrant with military force to quell the violence that is unleashed by removing all restraint. That's what has to happen, because there's no state of human nature worse than anarchy. No state, none. People will always prefer a tyrant to anarchy, because anarchy is when you go outside and there is no consequences for doing whatever you want, in which case you can get mugged or stabbed or raped or whatever in the streets and there's going to be no consequences. That's anarchy. You can't live in that society. You'll beg somebody come along and protect you, and people will hire a local militia or police, whatever, to enforce law and order and prevent that sort of randomized violence from breaking out. And that's what happens in failed states. And eventually the military comes in to create law and order. And they don't care about your civil liberties at that point. That's what happens, though, when this randomized attack on authority happens in the name of reason, pure reason. The Romantic solution to this is very different. As I say, they see and they're trying to think deeply on this topic. I'll give them credit. I was just talking about this in lit theory, by the way, in my class this morning, but going on a different tangent. But the Romantics see the solution to the problem of the Enlightenment as a connected pursuit of progress. They haven't abandoned the aims of the Enlightenment. In fact, the mottos of the French Revolution are liberty, equality, and fraternity. All these words beg the question of what is meant by them, because these are notoriously slippery terms and get very different definitions, very different ages. But those are the models of the French Revolution, and the Romantics in general, and Blake being one of them, is very supportive of the aims of the French Revolution. And yet he opposes the Enlightenment. It's not because he opposes progress, he opposes reasoning as the means of bringing about progress. He thinks it will come about through the imagination. And that's a sympathy that is more human and humanizing and humane. And in my class this morning, I argued that the Romantic period is actually in almost total congruence with the Enlightenment. Blake, whatever, it's not Blake Lively, oh my goodness, this is the problem these days. William Blake, thank you. I got to put William Blake in. This is my fault. How dumb was that? I'm trying to be fast here. William Blake poems, there you go. And we will look at songs. Yes, PDF, thank you. No more of this. Gutenberg, that should work. William Blake is going to come along and he's going to write poetry predicated on the idea that the imagination is a faculty that can deliver the utopia that the Enlightenment cannot. It's an image-making faculty. It's a faculty that has prejudices, but the prejudices that it inculcates are universal ones, and yet they are ones that we can identify with, and they fit the human frame in a way the Enlightenment does not. Blake was an engraver as well, and you can see that he's famous for his engravings and paintings at that. And also a poet. He writes a wide variety of poetry, but this is his most famous collection, his Songs of Innocence and Experience. And note the subtitle here, which is always important, showing the two contrary states of the human soul. What are the two contrary states? Well, one is innocence and the other is experience. And with that in mind, he will come up with little antitheses here. He'll have a Song of Innocence dedicated to a variety of different topics, and I'm going to look at some of them shortly. And then he's going to have Songs of Experience and there's a Song of Experience that fits with the Song of Innocence. It's its counterpart, showing the two sides of the human soul, one from innocence, one from experience. So there'll be an introduction. There'll be the lamb here. There'll be the tiger down here. There'll be the little black boy here. There'll be the little black boy down here as well, I believe, and so forth. But they're counterparts. And what is meant by innocence and experience varies from poem to poem as well. But he sees innocence as a state of pre-prejudicial views of life. Before we were corrupted by the world, let me say this about romantics, poetics in general. From a Christian perspective, it denies original sin. It thinks that when children are born, they are innocent. They're not tainted by sin. Sin is something that comes about as a result of society. But in the state of nature, we have no sin in us. Sin is something that comes as we become socialized. So society is the root of sin. Yes?
Just a comment that I feel goes into the topic. A good example of these things are happening right now socially in my home country, which is we have been into different type of governments throughout the last 10 years, which is going either far right or far left, and that's how the people know it. But now there's the new president. You probably know him or have heard of it, Nayib Bukele. He's basically he has militarized the country itself, so apparently it's more safe to tourists. But depending on who you ask locally, it says
less
a completely
safe.
different story.
Yeah.
You know, so now everyone outside the world in the media, because this also something that this guy's done is he has closed every document of the government, so nobody can see what government's spending, doing in terms of laws or anything. Nobody outside the country can look at that. Even inside the country cannot.
Are you talking about Canada?
No, I'm talking about
Oh,
South.
sorry.
I'm talking about a different country. Yeah, but I'm just saying it's because some people are really, as you're saying, oh, this guy's the freedom bringer, or like
Sure.
who's bringing the
Sure.
freedom that we deserve.
Sure.
So,
But he will get broad support in the sense that he creates order rather than chaos, because everyone recognizes that chaos is a terrible state. But what he will immediately do, which always happens, and there's no way of avoiding this actually when you get in that position, is that there are people that oppose him and they're not going to get the same benefits as those that are on his side. So it ends up being a partisan thing. It's not for all the people, in fact. It's for his political party. And so tribalism of a sort ensues, right? And that's because they want to impose the ordering principle from above rather than recognizing natural authorities throughout society that they don't want to involve themselves, like the order of the family. It doesn't recognize, the problem is not it believes in authority, it believes in exclusive authority. That's the problem. It doesn't believe in the authority of the house, it doesn't believe in the authority of the church, it doesn't believe the authority of anything other than itself, its own absolute authority. That's the problem. It's not that authority is not the problem. It's that it sees itself with a godlike authority. It's above all questioning. It doesn't see itself under the authority of God. There's going to be no consequences to this. So it tends to be characteristic of atheistic regimes as well. I'm not saying it's the case here, but often. So there's no restraint on it, and that's when it becomes seriously problematic. And no limit to what it might do at that point, because there is no limit to what it sees as its own aims. And it always sees its intentions as good, whereas everyone else may experience it rather differently. At any rate, back to Mr. Blake here in the Songs of Innocence. And I was going to start you off with Caravaggio and Mona Lisa and Christ in the Wilderness. Forget that. I'll come back to that some other time. All began good and ended rather differently. This was simply to show perspective, actually. So Caravaggio here, the head of John the Baptist. Bring me the head of John the Baptist. Or this is David and Goliath. Can I actually get this for once? There you go. Technique's called chiaroscuro. Background is dark, foreground is white. You can see the white in contrast to the dark. It's a technique. And it allows the light to stand out, just like when you go to a jeweler's and you're looking at the diamond and it's got a matte black background and you've got the bright light behind it, and it allows the diamond to seem even more bright by contrast. So it's distinctions. Literature does this as well, by the way. And the question was asked about Paradise Lost. This is what Milton is doing in Paradise Lost by showing the difference between light and darkness and Satan and so forth. It's not that there is such a thing as darkness. It's rather Satan is a privation of the light. There's an absence of, you can't see anything there. He's bringing to prominence the light of the world by demonstrating that there. Now look at Mona Lisa in the Renaissance. She is in the foreground. The background is all very hazy and so forth. Come the 19th century, it's all very different. Even perspective has lost, where we tend to be looking in the background. There isn't even a front and center in the light. Think of the Monet and the sort of watercolory, hazy, emphasizing the feelings of the artist in the situation that are coloring the landscape as much as anything. But note the difference between David here holding up the head of Goliath to this portrait of Christ in the wilderness here by a Russian artist, where Christ is clearly the center of focus, yes, just like the Renaissance. But this is the temptation in the wilderness. Does Christ look light or does Christ look dark? Obvious. What does the darkness suggest in the portrait? anguish. It's more like Garden of Gethsemane stuff, but temptation, dark thoughts. He's looking downwards. He's hungry. He's not, and the brightness is in the background. This is the wilderness that he's in there. The effect of perspective creates a certain mood or setting, and you can do this artistically, and it has a significant effect. The Romantics are going to do the same thing as the Enlightenment, but instead of universalizing in an abstract way a view from nowhere, they give a view from somewhere, and the somewhere is very particular. And the particularities are on the left-wing side of the political canvas. The subject matter is almost always, well, it's always a commoner. It's not an aristocrat. It's not a king. There's no Odysseus. There's no Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. There's no noble characters whatsoever. It's not about heroes. It's about people that we don't pay attention to. We will find children. We will find women. We will find orphans. We will find outcasts. We'll find criminals. We'll find people who have lost their minds. They are the subject of the poetry in the Romantic period, and they're going to get attention. And again, they had not been given any attention before. Now we're going to place serious attention and exclusive attention on them. That's the new subject matter of the poetry. But there's going to be more than that. They're going to present that view of life that had been ignored in general as heroic in the past. And they're going to present it as the achievement of the common folk. Common life is presented as heroic. Children are presented as heroic. And for the first time, we will start to see novels where children are the main protagonist. Children fiction for the first time. And furthermore, and I'll say more about this in classes to come, the children also, the main heroes in these fictional accounts, have no families. They're orphans. It's a physical way of representing a utopian ideal. Now you have an individual here, and it's a very small individual, but that's the center of the universe being looked at. Rather from a view from nowhere, you're looking at the view from somewhere, and the somewhere is in a very, from the perspective of history, a very needy individual, totally dependent at, everything's against that person, but that's the hero of the work from here on going forward. It's a very swift shift, and one that we still live with, quite frankly, because almost every fictional account to this very day has orphans as the heroes, all the way up. And I can give you a long list of them, but you could come up with themselves. But the Romantics begin all of this. Yes?
Was Dickens in there?
Yes. No, he's not a Romantic. He's a Victorian. But all his fictional characters, almost all of them without exception, are orphans.
And Victorian is after Romantic?
It is, from the time of Queen Victoria, so 1830 onwards. And this is 1789 to 1830, roughly. That's the Romantic period. And that's but the Romanticism carries on as a way of extending the Enlightenment but humanizing it. The universality is now put in the person, not of the king, who's distant, remote, above us, but in the terms of the child who's below us, whom we have pity and compassion for. We can imagine, because we've been children, but we can imagine this child as being the source of a better future than we have right now. And so education theory gets flipped around as well from a classical perspective to progressivism, where it becomes child-centered rather than adult-centered. It's not become as me, as I follow Jesus, follow also me, says Paul. So he's the role model, the adult. Be like Jesus. Be like Paul. Think like me. Now it's be as a child, think as a child, act like a child. Christians of this era will be happy to quote that verse and misrepresent what's being said there. It's not talking about remaining immature forever. Certainly not. But you might think it is. Anyway, what an introduction. I've spent an hour. Not quite, 50 minutes. Introduction to the introduction. Introduction. This is the introduction of the songs of innocence. Note this. Let me blow this up a bit so you can see it at the back. Can you see it at the back? Well, you can now. Note the character of the verse, the protagonist, that is, who's the speaker. Note the landscape. Note the mood. Piping down the valleys wild, piping songs of pleasant glee, on a cloud I saw a child, and he laughing said to me, pipe a song about a lamb. So I piped with merry cheer. Piper, pipe that song again. So I piped, he wept to hear. Drop thy pipe, thy happy pipe, sing thy songs of happy cheer. So I sung the same again, while he wept with joy to hear. Piper, sit thee down and write in a book that all may read. So he vanished from my sight, and I plucked a hollow reed. And I made a rural pen, and I stained the water clear, and I wrote my happy songs every child may joy to hear. What do you note about the poem? First impressions. Anything? Yes? Rhyme. Okay? Good? Metrically regular as well? Right? So orderly?
Reference to like happy things, just like happy,
Very.
happy cheer, merry cheer.
Even repetitive, but emphasis, yes. So very joyous, very happy, and repetitively so, like children are. Again, 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 sing it again, again. Children love repetition, by the way. As you get older, you find it stale, boring, whatever. Oh, not again. But children love repetition. That's okay. And adults hate it, and they can't imagine. We know kids hate that, and they think, no, you hate that, but the kids don't hate it. They like repetition. It's how they learn. Yes. Other? Yes?
Yeah, 5 stanzas, but also the and I is repeated 4 times in the last 2 stanzas.
And I. So, and he, and, you mean?
No, and I plucked the hollow reed, and I made a row pen, and I stained the water clear, and I wrote my happy song.
Okay, so are you talking about the fact that the line begins with and?
No, at the last 2 stanzas.
Yep.
Stanza 4 and 5.
Yep.
It's and I.
And I plucked, and I made, and I stained.
Yeah. And I wrote.
And I wrote.
Yeah.
So at that point, there's actions are following. So it begins with 2 protagonists, the shepherd and the lamb. No, the shepherd and the child. Singing about a lamb. And there's song. So one's a piper, and he sees the child on a cloud. It's a strange place for the child to be. But the child's on a cloud. Is this an imaginary world? I guess. Doesn't really matter. Even though he's in the valleys piping songs, he sees a cloud, a child on a cloud. I don't even think we're bothered by this fact, and we just sort of move on from it. I've never really made much of this, but it's strange that the child is on a cloud. Is the child in heaven? Is like, what's going on there? And asks him to sing a song about a lamb, and he capitalizes the lamb. And in a Christian context, everyone's thinking, does he mean the Lamb of God that takes away the sins of the world? Is that lamb? I mean, he's capitalized it. But lambs are also part of a very rural landscape, especially if you're in Britain, especially in certain areas, that lambs are part of the landscape of agriculture. In spring, which is a very cheerful season, things are growing. Birds and the bees are doing what birds and the bees do. And he piped. Now, when he did this, there's laughter. Well, note also a few other things which you didn't note. There's speaking and hearing, and there's responsiveness to this. There's a repetition, but there's a change in this. At first, he's laughing to the song. He demands a repeat. Second time, he's weeping. Is it because he's laughing so hard he can't contain himself and the tears come out? That happens. Or is there a change in the mood? Is he growing there? And is there some bitterness, a loss of innocence that's going on there. That is my view. There's a growth here, and there's a sense of loss. At first, the first time you hear something and do anything, there's a brightness to it and an experience that can't be repeated, even if you repeat it. The repetition actually is losing something of the original experience. The first time you've heard a song, the first time you've seen a film, you can't be surprised anymore. Remember, this is the song of innocence. Once you've heard the song, it's no longer innocent, it's a repetition of that. Yes, okay, but now he's weeping, and so then he says, okay, drop thy pipe, just sing it. He sings it, now he weeps with joy to hear. And at this point, then, there's a further transformation. This is a really odd thing. And these are all coming from the child, by the way. The child's growing up. He demands that the piper sit down and write it so that everybody can hear it. And as soon as he sits down to write it, what happens? The child disappears. The innocence is gone. And there are certain signs of transgression in the fall, even in this then. He plucked a hollow reed. He's taking something out of the earth. He makes a rural pen, yes, but he stains the water clear. And then he writes the happy songs. But the sense of the happiness of the song is tinged by the fact that the child and his innocence is gone. And even though the tale goes on, something's lost in the process. I think that's what I mean, you don't want to make too much of one single poem, but that is the general trajectory of Romanticism, is that you begin in innocence when everything is bright. And by the way, films do this all the time, portray happy childhoods, and then some event happens. Mom dies, dad dies, both parents die, something happens, the dog dies, who knows. Some horrible event, and suddenly the child is no longer the child. The child has experienced grief, suffering, or simply has got older and more experienced, and the repetition of experience means that the days get longer. Do the days actually get longer? They're still 24 hours. Do they seem longer now than when you were a child? Yes. No. Which? Are the days longer or shorter? Shorter. Well, you get to be my age. I'm serious. If you think it must be terrible to be sick for a long time and so forth, when you're young, it's far worse. It's far worse. As you get older, the days get shorter and quicker. Time speeds up.
But life also feels longer.
Yes. Yes. You feel like Bilbo Baggins, like butter over too much bread. You're stretched and thin. And everything is, the experience is starting to lose its savor. I mean, your senses are failing, your eyes are failing, you're getting weaker and all that sort of stuff. Yeah, that's only part of it. It's that there's something about the whole human experience that is changing with experience. And one of the main things is the vividness of first impressions is gone, and what you're left with is an awareness of things that are really important, and you ignore all the other things. You don't have this when you're young. Somebody was asking me about this. How do I focus on and know certain things? It's because I remember certain things and everything else I've forgotten. It just fades away. But you remember particularly things when you're young. All your grandparents, they remember things vividly from when they were young. And then afterwards, they don't even remember what they did last week. That goes with, and this is what, and so what do they do with the song? They write it down. Okay. So there's a theory of inspiration in this as well. And I'll come to you. There's a theory of inspiration here, which is this, and I'll say it to you because it's not going to be in the poems, but it is in the age. A theory that in the beginnings of mankind, people composed songs, sung songs, and there was a power to those original songs, and a potency and a vividness that was captured by communities who would memorize those songs and repeat it in that way. And then eventually, over the course of time, that initial, the vitality of the culture started to fade, and so that they would not lose the treasure of that experience, and they would be able to pass it on to the next generation, they wrote it down. And at that point, by trying to keep what should be memorized, they lost memory right at that point. They didn't have to memorize it because they could just read the script. They didn't memorize anything. When your grandparents, your great-grandparents went to university or school, they were asked to memorize things. And if I asked them a question, they would draw upon their memory because they committed it to memory, and then they would tell me what the answer was. If I ask somebody now what something is, they'll say, let me just look, and they'll tell me, that's not what I was asking you. I wasn't asking you to do a word search on the internet. I was asking you if you knew, was it within you, your framework of reference to know this fact? Or are you dependent on some other object? And here's what he's illustrating. You're dependent now on something external. It's not a part of you. So an innocence and something vividness in the past has been lost. He's also demonstrating this. There's a fall of sorts happening even within the Song of Innocence. The first one. Go ahead. Yes, comment or question.
Is this somewhat of a tipping of the hat to the muse invocation?
To the muse of?
To the muse invocation? Because it's like not formally saying.
No, I don't think so.
But he's saying like, this is the introduction to the whole thing, this whole part of the book, the innocence, and then the second one, the second introduction. I don't think he actually mentions writing anything, but it's the same thing. He's calling on the voice of, not calling on it, but talking and saying, hey, here's the voice of this guy, Bard.
Well, let's look at that since you mentioned it.
And then he continues on. So it's kind of like somewhat symmetrical to that.
So it's not an invocation. No.
No.
But he is speaking of inspiration and loss of inspiration in that first poem. I think there's a loss of vividness, a loss of power, and committing it then to paper. Now, by the way, in the 19th century, they will gladly acknowledge two great men, even though they are not in general Christians, and those two men are Jesus and Socrates. What do those two have in common? You ever thought of any commonalities there? Well, they're both killed by the city. There's that.
Voluntarily.
Figures of wisdom, yes, voluntarily as well. But the point that they pointed was they never wrote anything down. They didn't write anything down. It was for their successors to write things down. Plato wrote the sayings of Socrates down, put them in dialogues. Jesus' followers wrote down what Jesus said, but who knows what he actually said? And the quest for the historical Jesus will push down on exactly that thing and say, well, how do we know that Jesus said these things and so forth? Did he actually say this? And then a bunch of scholars will sit around and pick what we have in the Gospels apart and say, no, I don't think he said this, and yes, he said that, and you'll mark so forth, and then you're left with, I don't want to get into that whole mixed bag of things there, but the fact that Jesus never wrote anything is a sign of his genius. Geniuses don't write things down. Their followers write them down, and when they write them down, they pervert the original intentions of those geniuses that they've tried to commemorate in their works. Now, that's a view of the loss of inspiration, which also is a part of the Romantic project. They believe that the past was a source of goodness and that we can't hold on to and to some degree try to capture and lose in the attempt. And we've moved further and further away from nature. And so the Romantics will regard nature and the state of original nature as an ideal that we want to get back to. We want to get back closer to nature. So they will idealize nature and present it as wholly good, solely good, in fact. There's no sense of good and better in nature. There's no natural goods per se. It's just that nature is good. That's characteristic of the Romantic period. In fact, they divinize nature. For the first time, we will get in the 19th century national parks. That's not surprising. There were no nations before this, strictly speaking, but a place where there is to be no sense of human cultivation. It's just the wilderness. I mean, in Canada, they're all over the place, these big parks, right? But they're supposed to be unspoiled. You can't live there. You might camp there, but you're not supposed to show any signs of having camped there. You can't build a cabin there. You can't build right? It's supposed to be unspoiled. What's the point of that?
Preservation of nature.
Without any human influence. Why is that considered to be good?
Humans tend to be bad.
Who says?
Say humans.
Satan. Yeah, good answer. Yes. Yes.
Someone said humans.
Humans.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Humans are bad, which I agree with.
People have said that it's bad for us to be in nature and to change it and to affect it, but this is a contradiction of the cultural mandate, which is to take the earth and fill and subdue it. Be fruitful, multiply, fill and subdue the earth. Under the Romantics, the best state of nature is one where there is no human influence. This is the beginning of the environmental movement. It posits a view of nature which nobody in human history has ever held. Nobody in human history has ever held this view of nature. That it is a good place, solely good, wholly good, and best when it shows no sign of us interacting with it at all. It's an idealization of nature. It's a view from nowhere, but now it's presented in nature, not up in the clouds, but down in the world. The idealization is brought down to the earth. That's the second feature of Romanticism. Besides the imagination, connecting things and humanizing them, it idealizes nature. The third feature I actually already mentioned, its subject matter tend to be children, or the marginalized, or those that are ignored, that are not part of the adult world. Second introduction. Hear the voice of the bard who present, past, and future sees, whose ears have heard the holy word that walked among the ancient trees, calling the lapsed soul and weeping in the evening dew that might control the starry pole and fallen light renew. O earth, return, arise from out the dewy grass. Night is worn, and the morn rises from the slumberous mass. Turn away no more. Why wilt thou turn away? The starry floor, the watery shore, is given thee till the break of day. What do you notice about this one in contrast with the previous one? First one had a voice of the child. Here we have the voice of the bard. What else? Yes?
5 lines in each stanza.
So it's the same.
Before it had 4 lines in each
Okay.
stanza and 5 stanzas. This one has 5 lines.
Yep.
4 stanzas.
Yep. Sure.
It doesn't state the happiness no more. It's just
The happiness is gone. Good. Yes?
And like there's not like as much even metering, or
It's a little bit irregular. Yep.
yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Yes?
I think the other one, well, this one seems more solemn all
Mhm.
the way through,
Mhm.
because the other one didn't really start off solemn, it ended solemn.
It ended a little bit more solemn, but not as solemn as this. Yes. Yes?
There is sadness in the words as well, especially present, past, future sees, weeping in the evening dew, and then the fallen light needs to be renewed within 90 years.
It's an awareness of a fall. That's not even, it's hinted at in the first one, but it's not mentioned explicitly. And there's again, the voice of the bard, it's an adult, and a bard is a poet who has a perspective on life, that past, present, and future. So there's something that comes with experience, yes. But along with that comes what we would call wisdom. Wisdom actually comes, this is a hard thing for people who are older to grasp. There's a cost for wisdom, and part of it is forgetting. Because you remember what's important. That's what wisdom is. You don't become more intelligent, you become wiser. That's not the same thing at all. Wisdom is recognizing the important things and passing, no, this, not this, do this. Everyone gets older, not everyone gets wiser. Yes, calling the lapsed soul even, it speaks in theological terms. Children don't talk about souls. They're talking about the lamb. But now we're talking about the lapsed soul, a fallen soul. And that the idea of fallen light renew even, and the sense of calling to return. And the finitude of time. We only have till the break of day. Time is short. So it's just a totally different mood. Created by all the features that were mentioned already. I could spend a lot more time on these individual poems, but I'm not going to get through many of them if I do that. So let me come to another one. What do I want to do here? Chimney sweeper. Context. Chimney sweeper. If you've looked at what's this? Where they have the chimney sweeper? Mary Poppins, the chimney sweepers. Chimney sweeper is a profession, very dangerous, and they tend to employ little boys to do it. Little orphan boys at that. And they can make money doing it and so forth, but the age of the expected life of a child that does this is not very long, because they inhale the soot and they die very quickly. But you need to go down the chimneys and clear them, because otherwise the coal that they're burning the fires from, it gathers inside the chimneys and catches on fire, and the whole house burns down. So you have to clean out the chimneys. You send a chimney sweeper down to do that. So there's the context. To have a chimney at all means that you need a house and you need the wealth to own the house. So rich people employ other people, poor little boys, to sweep their chimneys, called the chimney sweeper. When my mother died, I was very young, and my father sold me, while yet my tongue could scarcely cry, weep, 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 weep. He can't say sweep, but he's weeping. I mean, it's... So your chimneys I sweep, and in soot I sleep. There's little Tom Dacre, who cried when his head that curled like a lamb's back was shaved. He had curly, probably white hair, blonde hair. So I said, hush, Tom, never mind it, for when your head's bare, you know that the soot cannot spoil your white hair. And so he was quiet. And that very night, as Tom was a-sleeping, he had such a sight that thousands of sweepers, Dick, Joe, Ned, and Jack, were all of them locked up in coffins of black. And by came an angel who had a bright key, and he opened the coffins and set them all free. Then down a green plain, leaping, laughing, they run, and wash in a river and shine in the sun. Then naked and white, all their bags left behind, they rise upon clouds and sport in the wind. And the angel told Tom, if he'd be a good boy, he'd have God for his father and never want joy. And so Tom awoke, and we rose in the dark and got with our bags and our brushes to work. Though the morning was cold, Tom was happy and warm. So if all do their duty, they need not fear harm. What do you think about the poem? It's a song of innocence. Sure. It's from the boy's perspective, right? Hardship, poor, but he's very naive. There's a discrepant awareness between we who are reading it and the child who is accepting this and is very happy about it. He's happy to go to work. He's heard that if he's a good boy and he keeps on with the chimney sweeping, that he'll have God as his father and he'll never want joy, and he's very happy. Okay, he goes back to work. What does the reader see this? I said to you last class that Blake was a satirist. But
the child's innocence, like fake innocence, still in place. Like, for example, how the poem starts. Oh, when my mother was really young, how kids tend to acknowledge the tragedies with a certain sense of yet happiness or hopeness, if you will. Where he says, "Oh, when my mom died," and starting the poem with that just tells you the tone that the poem is going to go with. And then just saying how the innocent, right on the next sentence, where he says, "weep" instead of like the right word. You know, how the kid is losing the innocence, but it still keeps.
Oh, you're giving the kid too much credit here, I think. I don't think he's lost his innocence. I think he's still, and this is why the poem works. We have a child who thinks they're no longer innocent, and we see that they are still innocent because they're happy to go to work. He doesn't have any sense that he's being exploited. He has no sense, but we do. So it's a song of innocence, but it's about the exploitation of innocence. It's about the cruelty and fallenness of the world. I think that's the general conviction here. And note that his head is shaved like a lamb. Reference the lamb at the beginning. Well, now the lamb's been shaved. So it's powerful. And again, it refers to death as if this is coming and you can be happy about it, and there's no sense of any adult responsibility here. This is a song of innocence, song of experience. Oh my goodness, I got 1 minute. So here we go. 1 minute and I can't even find it. Oh no. That's, you got to go to the beginning. Chimney sweeper, where is he? Chimney sweeper. A little black thing among the snow, crying, "Weep, weep," in notes of woe. Where are thy father and mother? Say, they are both gone up to the church to pray. Because I was happy upon the heath and smiled among the winter snow, they clothed me in the clothes of death and taught me to sing the notes of woe. And because I am happy and dance and sing, they think they have done me no injury, and are gone to praise God and his priest and king, who made up a heaven of our misery. What's the difference between the two poems?
He's recognized that he's been exploited.
Yes, exactly that. That's the main difference. Yes.
This child also seems to be
Bitter. Weep, weep, notes of woe. Bitter towards whom? His parents? The church.
God and
Religion. God. All of those things. That's the note of experience. Powerful song of innocence, song of experience. But note this, Blake is not only giving social commentary, he says that it's two sides of the human soul. So it's a bigger picture than that. He's talking about the soul in general and about soul formation. Now, it's impossible, I'm going to have to conclude here, it's impossible in Blake's understanding to not become experienced. It's impossible to stay innocent, and you don't want to stay innocent. But what you want to do is use your imagination to recover what's lost in your innocence, and to restore it in a different way with the light of experience behind you. Imagination is meant to clothe the world with images that will take account of human experience and the goodness in innocence, but also the good that comes with experience to some degree. And so we will promote the imagination as the faculty that is able to reconcile those two opposites. But it's impossible. You can't avoid experience. It comes with growing older. Coming into a fallen world, note that he doesn't begin as a fallen world, it falls. It's taking experience as the measure of doctrine. Because doctrinally, when you're a child, you have no awareness of sinfulness. And it's taking that as normative, as a doctrinal position, which just begs the question, well, then how did the fall ever happen? If everybody who begins as a child is good, then how did they become fallen? Well, society made them out. Yeah, but before there was society, how did that happen? And there's just, there's no answer to that. Well, that's right. But it's a clever portrait of it, and it's promoting an Enlightenment view, but now it's promoting, rather than a rational solution, there's an imaginative solution. So imagination becomes the main faculty through which the Romantics and their successors will seek to heal the problems of human nature. And I'll just leave it off with that for now. and I apologize for going